Committee will come to order. At the conclusion of opening statements yesterday, the chair called up H.R. 4596, and the bill was open for amendment at any point. The chair would recognize Mr. Walden for the purpose of offering an amendment.
I thank the chairman, and we have a bipartisan amendment to offer to H.R. 4596, and I'd ask the clerk to call up the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 4596, offered by Mr. Walden. Page 2, after line 11, insert the following.
The staff will distribute the amendment, and it will be considered as read, and the gentleman from Oregon is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
I thank the chairman. Over the past 2 months, our subcommittee on telecommunications has worked to craft a bill that would achieve 2 goals that are central to this full committee's mission: relieving regulatory burdens for small businesses and protecting consumers. So the Small Business Broadband Deployment Act would extend the Federal Communications Commission's existing exemption for small businesses from the enhanced transparency reporting requirements of the 2015 Open Internet Order, as well as increase the threshold for defining what a small business is. At our January legislative hearing on this subject, we heard from a small internet service provider who shared the dilemma that many small ISPs face in these circumstances. Should they put up new equipment, or should they hire a lawyer to help with compliance? Should they improve service for customers, or should they devote their financial resources to sifting through regulatory language and drafting extensive reports on packet loss? Our discussion draft would seek to alleviate the unnecessary burden associated with these requirements. The ISPs are still subject. They are still subject to the 2010 transparency rules, and customers are still provided with all the information about their service they have come to expect. By extending the existing exemption, however, we're giving certainty to small businesses seeking to make budgetary and operational decisions in a long-term fashion. We've also increased the threshold for the definition of small business, bringing in closer in line with some of the Commission's previous definitions that were blessed by the Small Business Administration. Especially want to thank Congressman Loebsack and his staff, as well as the minority committee staff, for their work on this bill, and especially on this amendment. These negotiations have produced what I think is a strong bill that helps protect these vital small providers who serve constituents like those in my district in eastern Oregon or in Mr. Loebsack's district in Iowa, who might otherwise not have the robust internet service that small ISPs provide. And so, Mr. Chairman, I think the amendment we have before us today reached the compromise we always hoped to reach. It would sunset this provision after 5 years. It requires the FCC after 6 months to submit a report to our committee and other relevant committees regarding the exemption, whether it should be made permanent, and whether our definition of small business makes sense. And further, we said that not more than this would apply to ISPs that have 250,000 subscribers. That seemed to be a better number than the 100,000 the FCC picked. And so I was glad we were able to reach a conclusion in a fair and balanced way on this bill. I thank Mr. Loebsack especially for his work on this. And I would yield what time I have remaining to the gentleman from Iowa if he'd like to comment on that.
Thank you, Mr. Walden, and thank you for working on this. I want to thank you and your staff and subcommittee ranking member Ms. Eshoo and her staff for working so well with me and my staff. The staff really did a lot of work on this, as is always the case. It's a common sense agreement, and I think this is a tremendous example of how we can work across the aisle, which is what I think folks in our districts really want us to do, to make sure that we can get things done and do something that makes sense for our constituents, and I do thank you. As I said when I offered my amendment in subcommittee, my goal throughout this process has been to strike a careful balance between the important consumer protections in the FCC's transparency rule and the cost for smaller internet service providers. And I think what we have achieved with this amendment is in fact that goal. For me, the legislation is really about rural broadband development. I've often mentioned that I have well over 100 separate internet service providers in Iowa. And this amendment will allow those providers, along with small providers throughout the country, to focus their limited resources on deploying more broadband, which rural America desperately needs, and offering new and improved services while giving them the time they need to comply with the FCC's additional requirements. Again, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate all of your great support on this and the ranking member as well. And I'm really happy that we did come to this agreement today, and hopefully everyone's going to vote for this. And thank you, and I yield back. Thank you.
And with that, Mr. Chairman, I ask our members to support the amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Other members, Chair would recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Eshoo, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. I'm very pleased that that we've reached a compromise on H.R. 4596. I think all the good reasons have been stated by both Chairman Walden and Representative Loebsack. We did an informal survey. This is for members that aren't part of this subcommittee, and I think you find it interesting. An informal survey of associations representing small broadband providers, and they suggested that an exemption of the FCC's enhanced transparency rules for companies with 250,000 or fewer subscribers would adequately address the vast majority of their membership. So this has been realigned from the original proposals, and I think that it makes sense. This is obviously a bipartisan amendment, and it reflects this data by protecting the nation's smallest ISPs, but it also continues to ensure that the majority of consumers receive the full set of benefits promised by the enhanced transparency rules, including clear disclosure of promotional rates, fees, surcharges, and data caps. And this is very important to preserve these benefits for consumers. They are battles that were waged and heavily sought. So I think additionally, by including a 5-year sunset, the amendment gives the FCC further time to study whether or not the exemption should be made permanent and how a small ISP should be defined. So I think that very importantly that broadband providers of all sizes will continue to be responsible for following the FCC's bright line, and it is a bright line, against blocking, throttling, and paid prioritization, as well as the transparency rules that were adopted in 2010. So for these reasons, I support the amendment. I thank Chairman Walden and Congressman Loebsack for the work that they did, and to not only my staff, but certainly the committee staff on both sides of the aisle. And with that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, Chair will call the question on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Oregon. Bipartisan amendment. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say nay. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? Seeing none, the vote occurs on H.R. 4596 as amended. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The bill is agreed to. Chair would now call up H.R. 4583 and ask the clerk to report.
H.R. 4583 to promote a 21st century energy and manufacturing workforce.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Are there amendments to the bill? Chair, the question now occurs on favorably reporting. Chair would recognize the gentleman from Illinois for
Mr. Chairman,
to sponsor the bill.
I move to strike the last word.
Chair recognizes you.
Mr. Chairman, I want to commend you and Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Pallone, and the committee staff for working with my office to include the 21st century workforce legislation within the package of bills that we will be marking up here today. You stated, Mr. Chairman, that workforce development must be an essential component of any comprehensive energy policy. So I look forward to working with you to ensure that even as we move out of the committee process, the 21st Century Workforce Bill is part of any discussion moving forward regarding the nation's energy policy. Mr. Chairman, I must also publicly acknowledge the leadership role of my colleague, Mr. Hudson of North Carolina, and his staff for their help in bringing us together on this important piece of legislation that's before the committee today. The good faith talks between my office, the majority and the committee staff, and minority committee staff, and Mr. Hudson's office have resulted in bipartisan jobs bill that will go a long way in helping our nation's economy to get back on track by providing working opportunities for everyone. And why is this 21st century workforce bill so necessary? Mr. Chairman, just last week, my office had yet another meeting, this time with an energy company out of the great state of North Carolina, with representatives who informed us right now, today, as we speak, that they have over 1,000 jobs openings that they cannot fill because they cannot find qualified, skilled workers. In fact, Mr. Chairman, my office has been holding many of these types of meetings over the past 4 years with a variety of different energy and manufacturing industries who are facing this very same problem. At a time when African American and Latino unemployment rates are still too high, when too many female heads of households cannot find adequate employment to take care of their families, when veterans who are returning home from defending their country still cannot find work, it is a travesty that eager employers cannot find the trained workers that they need even at this very precise moment. Mr. Chairman, this common sense jobs bill will help us to match up the trained, skilled, qualified candidates with the good paying jobs and careers that would help lift up their community, strengthen the energy industry, and bolster the entire American economy as a whole. So again, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you. I want to thank Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Pallone, Mr. Hudson, and all of my colleagues who helped get us to this point this morning. With this focus not only on the underserved communities, such as minorities and women and veterans, but also displaced and unemployed coal miners and other out-of-state energy workers. I can assure you, Mr. Chairman, that when this legislation passes through the committee and ultimately becomes law, it will go a long way in helping not only communities that look like the one I represent on the south side of Chicago, but help every community and every district throughout this nation. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Chair would recognize the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes.
I move to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman. I just want to congratulate Representative Rush for his efforts on this bill, and our colleagues on the other side of the aisle for their support of it. I'm very excited. Just recently, Mr. Rush, I was able to participate in a meeting in Baltimore involving the Department of Energy and the City of Baltimore and a number of partners to explore the opportunity for low-income solar installation and training in Baltimore. This would accelerate home weatherization, the deployment of solar panels and energy with a focus on low-income housing in the City of Baltimore to reduce the utility costs of people living in Baltimore, and at the same time, it's an opportunity to train unemployed or underemployed community members to become part of the energy industry workforce. It's a win-win situation. It's going to mean a great deal to the city of Baltimore. It's bringing in some of the premier workforce training nonprofit organizations in the city, teaming them up with the expertise that the Department of Energy can provide and other partners as well. And it's exactly the kind of project that I think this bill that we are hopefully about to approve here today would help to support across the country. So I applaud you for these efforts. We look forward to the opportunity that this will present for cities like Baltimore all across the country, and I yield.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak? Seeing none, the vote occurs on H.R. 4583. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. Meaning the chair, the ayes have it. The bill is agreed to. Chair will now call up H.R. 1268 and ask the clerk to report.
H.R. 1268, to amend the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007 to promote energy efficiency via information and computing technologies and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point. Chair would recognize Ms. Eshoo for offering an amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have an amendment. Yes.
Clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1268 offered by Ms. Eshoo of California.
And the staff will distribute the amendment. It will be considered as read, and the gentlelady will be recognized for 5 minutes in support of her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this markup. It's always good to come into the room to write a bill and know that we're going to pass it out of the full committee. And today it includes H.R. 1268. It's the Energy Efficient Government Technology Act that's on the committee's docket. This is a bipartisan amendment that's being offered with my legislative partner, Congressman Kinzinger. It makes minor technical and conforming changes to H.R. 1268 to ensure that the version the committee approves today is identical to the language that already, it's hard for me to concentrate with a side conversation right next to me. It makes minor technical and conforming changes to H.R. 1268 to ensure that the version the committee approves today is identical to the language that already passed the House in this Congress as part of H.R. 8. The act will make the federal government's IT and data centers more energy efficient by requiring federal agencies to, number one, utilize the best technologies and energy management strategies, formulate specific goals, and periodically evaluate their energy efficiency, and three, make data center energy usage statistics public in a way that empowers further innovation. This is I think, a powerful statistic. Data centers are the backbone of the 21st century economy, but they can be highly inefficient. The Department of Energy estimates that implementation of best practices alone could reduce the government's data center energy bill by 20 to 40%. So I think that this is something that's going to move us ahead. Again, this is a technical change, and once again, I want to thank Chairman Upton, our ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, and Mr. Kinzinger, who's been a partner in this, and urge everyone to support it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Would just reiterate that the chair does support her amendment. I think it's a good amendment, good improvement, bipartisan addition to the bill, and would support the amendment. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, the vote will occur on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from California. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Amendment is agreed to. Are there other amendments to the bill? Seeing none, the vote occurs on H.R. 1268 as amended. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. And the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill as amended is agreed to. Chair would now call up H.R. 2984, Fair Rates Act. Clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 2984, to amend the Federal Power Act to provide that any inaction by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission that allows a rate change to go into effect shall be treated as an order by the Commission for purposes of rehearing and court review.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill will be open for amendment at any point. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Any amendments to the bill? Seeing none, the vote will occur on H.R. 2984. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The bill is passed. Chair would now call up H.R. 3797 and ask the clerk to report.
H.R. 3797, to establish the basis by which the Administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency shall issue, implement, and enforce certain emission limitations and allocations for existing electric utility steam generating units that convert coal refuse into energy.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Are there any amendments to the bill? Chair would recognize the gentleman from New Jersey to offer an amendment. Clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Is this Amendment 1 or 2? 1?
01, I think.
Right. Amendment to H.R. 3797 offered by Mr. Pallone. Strike sections 2A6, 2A8, and 2B and redesignate accordingly.
And with that, the amendment will be considered as read. The staff will distribute the amendment, and the gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a targeted amendment that strikes Section 2B from the bill. Section 2B of the bill deals with EPA's cross-state air pollution rule, or also known as CSAPR, and this is one of the most important Clean Air Act rules in recent years. It protects the health of millions of Americans by requiring upwind states in the eastern and central United States to reduce power plant emissions that cause air quality problems in downwind states. An important feature of CSAPR is the trading program that allows sources in each state to meet emission budgets in many different ways, including trading of emissions allowances. This approach reduces the cost of compliance while ensuring reductions in air pollution. As we heard at the legislative hearing on this bill, in written testimony provided by EPA and by John Walk from the Natural Resources Defense Council, there are a number of policy and technical issues with this section of the bill, and I just want to touch on a few of them. First, by providing allocations to coal refuse units that cannot be traded, the Sense Act would remove economic incentives to reduce emissions at coal refuse units. By reallocating allowances from other sources within the state to coal refuse units and then limiting the ability of these coal refuse sources to transfer allocated allowances to other facilities, the bill would choose winners, that is the coal refuse units, and losers, that is all other coal plants in a given state. By interfering with market conditions, compliance costs would increase for facilities. The Sense Act would also remove states' rights when determining their method of compliance with CSAPR. As EPA notes in their testimony, the Clean Air Act gives states the authority to replace interstate transport federal implementation plans with approved state implementation plans. Further, CSAPR provides states with opportunities to reallocate allowances among their affected units. The Sense Act would deny states control over allocations of allowances by rendering any submitted state plan with a different allocation to these units unapprovable. And why supporters of this bill would want to change a successful EPA program to make it less flexible and more costly is simply beyond me. So I would urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this amendment to strike the CSAPR portion of the Sense Act. And I yield back unless one of my colleagues would like the time. I guess. Okay. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Other members, Chair would recognize the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Whitfield.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I respectfully oppose Mr. Pallone's amendment. We do have a difficult situation here. First of all, there are only 19 of these coal refuge plants in the country, and I guess about 14 of them are in the state of Pennsylvania. There's a lot of waste product out there from coal mining operations, and these coal refuge plants clean that waste up. So there's a significant environmental advantage in cleaning them up. Now, I would also mention on the SO2, sulfur dioxide, this does not change the overall limits whatsoever. It simply provides some additional allocations for these coal refuge plants. This amendment by Mr. Pallone would strike all of the provisions in this legislation relating to the cross-state air pollution rule. And these plants, the majority of them simply cannot meet those rules. And as I said, the 19 plants only provide 100 megawatts. And so you have one big benefit of cleaning up these wastes versus if we don't do something, closing basically these plants down. And there are a lot of jobs with these plants as well. So there's a significant benefit of keeping them operating. And that's what the purpose of the bill is, to simply allow continued operation which provides significant environmental benefits by remediating the coal refuge problem. The bill reallocates emission allowances under the cross-state rule from other plants to coal refuge to energy facilities in order to help their continued operation. And so this is not a big issue per se when you're only talking about 100 megawatts, but the environmental benefits and the job benefits are very important. So for that reason, I would respectfully oppose, and if the gentleman from I yield to balance my time, the gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I just want to weigh in and support with you against the amendment for the stated reasons. For my colleagues who don't serve on this subcommittee, a picture's worth 1,000 words, and if you could just picture these coal refuse areas and the ability to reclaim a lot to generate electricity and then clean up this so it doesn't affect the groundwater, it is as Chairman Whitfield said, there are significant environmental benefits to this. And so with that, I just want to, be supportive of the underlying bill and, of course, supportive of the chairman's discussion in opposition to the amendment. And I'll get back in time to.
And I may say, I know that this is of significant concern, and I know that Mr. Doyle has a real interest in this area because his area of the country is really affected by this as well. And although we opposed, or I certainly opposed this particular amendment, I would welcome the opportunity to continue working with the other side to see if there's some way before the bill gets to the floor or an amendment could be brought that would recognize the needs on both sides. Yield back.
Would the gentleman yield just for 30 seconds?
Yeah, yes.
I mean, my basic problem, as I guess I've already said, is that this Sense Act picks winners and losers, and it tips the scales in favor of coal refuse plants at the expense of all other plants within a state. And that's my basic problem here, and that's why I put forth this amendment. Regardless of anything else, I just think that this idea of picking winners and losers is just not the right way to proceed. But thank you for the time.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak? Gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to speak in support of Mr. Pallone's amendment. The Sense Act has a very important goal, ensuring that coal refuge facilities, many of which are located in my home state, can continue to operate in the years to come. These plants help process waste coal left from mining operations that closed down decades ago. And left unmanaged, these waste coal fields can damage local water sources and habitats. Coal refuge piles can also, from time to time, catch fire and release harmful toxins at ground level, polluting forests, neighborhoods, and schoolyards. Coal refuge plants unquestionably play an important role in efforts to repair and improve the environment in my state of Pennsylvania. A majority of these plants, as I've said, are in our state, and we are slowly working to remediate the extraordinary amount of waste coal in our state. Industry estimates that waste coal piles cover 170,000 acres in the state of Pennsylvania. And because of their impact, these plants have enjoyed bipartisan support in Pennsylvania for many years. However, I have to oppose the Sense Act as it's currently written today. It's not our job here at Energy and Commerce to pick winners and losers, and this bill uses the cross-state air pollution rule to help prop these plants up while hurting others. That's right, this bill would actually make it more difficult for other power plants, including coal-fired power plants, to comply with these regulations. The Sense Act also infringes on states' ability to craft their own implementation plan to comply with the cross-state air pollution rule. Now, it's unfortunate that my state hasn't yet submitted their own plan, like a plan that would help these coal refuge plants, but we should continue to uphold their ability to do so. We can't just come up with an alternative standard for important rules and regulations that protect the air we breathe. And that's what the second part of this bill does. It sets a bad precedent for future regulations as we try to protect our air and stop global warming. There are coal refuge plants in my home state that can and will be able to operate under the cross-state air pollution rule and the mercury air toxic standards, the two regulations addressed in the Sense Act. We need to make the processing of fossil fuels cleaner in this country, not carve out exceptions or exemptions for specific plants that may find doing so difficult while hurting other plants in the process. So I want to continue to look for ways to help coal refuge plants operate in the years to come, because they're very important to Pennsylvania. But the Sense Act isn't a good way to go about it as it's currently written, and for that reason, I urge my colleagues to support Mr. Pallone's amendment and oppose this bill. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, roll call is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes no. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield votes no. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes no. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes no. Mr. Walden. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy votes no. Mr. Burgess. Ms. Blackburn. Ms. Blackburn votes no. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes no. Mrs. McMorris-Rogers. Mrs. McMorris-Rogers votes no. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes no. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes no. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes no. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes no. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo votes no. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes no. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes no. Mr. Bilirakis. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Long. Mr. Long votes no. Mrs. Elmers. Mrs. Elmers votes no. Mr. Bouchon. Mr. Bouchon votes no. Mr. Flores. Mrs. Brooks. Mrs. Brooks votes no. Mr. Mullen. Mr. Mullen votes no. Mr. Hudson. Mr. Hudson votes no. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins votes no. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer votes no. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes aye. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo votes aye. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel votes aye. Mr. Green. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes aye. Ms. Capps. Ms. Capps votes aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes aye. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch votes aye. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes aye. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes aye. Mr. Yarmouth. Mr. Yarmouth votes aye. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark votes aye. Mr. Loebsack. Mr. Loebsack votes aye. Mr. Schrader. Mr. Schrader votes aye. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy votes aye. Mr. Cardenas. Mr. Cardenas votes aye. Chairman Upton.
Votes no. How does Mr. Burgess, Dr. Burgess, record? Any other members?
Burgess votes
Mr.
no.
Guthrie?
Mr. Guthrie votes no.
Mr. Walden?
Mr. Walden votes no.
Mr. Flores?
Mr. Flores votes no.
Other members wishing to change their vote or cast a vote? Seeing none, the clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 22 ayes and 29 nays.
22 ayes, 29 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill?
Mr. Chairman.
Chair would recognize gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk, Amendment D2.
Amendment to H.R. 3797 offered by Mr. Engel. Page 7, after line 14, insert the following new paragraph.
The amendment will be considered as read. The staff will distribute the amendment, and the gentleman from New York is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Earlier this month, the Energy and Power Subcommittee held a hearing where we identified numerous flaws in the Sense Act. Those flaws still exist, and my amendment would correct 2 of them. In a written statement submitted for our hearing, Janet McCabe, the Acting Assistant Administrator for the Office of Air and Radiation at EPA, argued that the Sense Act would remove the economic incentives to reduce emissions at waste coal plants because emissions allocations for those plants could not be traded under the cross-state air pollution rule. I questioned the witness about her assertion, and I received confirmation that the bill would likely result in less efficient and more costly compliance with CASPR. Moreover, the Sense Act would interfere with a state's right to determine how to best comply with CASPR by favoring waste coal burning plants over other in-state power plants. So this bill would take long-standing state authority, transfer it to the federal government, and then use that authority to pick winners and losers. My amendment would allow the state to remove applicability of Section 2B, application of CASPR to certain coal, refuge, electric, utility, steam generating units if the state determines that implementation of the subsection would increase the state's overall compliance costs. My amendment addresses the issue of more costly compliance with CASPR and returns the power to the states, something that we hear from both sides of the aisle, that the states should retain the power. So I urge a yes vote, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak? Chair would recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise to speak against the amendment. Just to make a couple points. The newest coal-fired power plant in my congressional district is 1,600 megawatts. So the other thing that people have to understand, these are very small. These are 100 megawatts. They're small. They're really designed to create some energy, but also really to clean up these sites, as people have talked about. And so that's why we're continue to be supportive of the underlying bill. The other thing I'd like to put forward is that when you address costs, what are going to be the cost of the closure of these small generating facilities? You'll lose, in Illinois, it would be to lose the property tax base. You'll lose the jobs. You'll lose the income. You'll lose the money that goes to the local school districts or the local county. In my area, a loss of even a plant that this small would be devastating to a rural community that I would have. So I have a problem with the cost-benefit analysis debate of this amendment, and I would ask my colleagues to vote against it, and I would yield to Chairman Whitfield.
Well, thank you very much. I just want to make one comment about this picking winners and losers. The Sense Act has been said that it's picking winners and losers here. Let me just say that EPA really is the one that picked the winners and losers. In the cross-state air pollution rule, the bituminous coal-fired refuge plants, EPA picked them to be the losers. And they also picked the bituminous coal-fired refuge plants to be the losers in MATS as well. These anthracite refuge plants can meet the alternative O2 standards. So those plants that can meet these standards are using anthracite, and that's because the sulfur content of the coal refuge in the anthracite region is lower. So all we're doing here in the Sense Act is giving the opportunity to those plants that can't quite meet that standard to give them a little help in meeting this standard without raising the overall SO2 caps, so that they can keep cleaning this up, keep these jobs, and certainly this is not going to go on forever because eventually it will be cleaned up. And I just wanted to point that out, and with that I would yield back the balance of Mr. Shimka's time.
And I'll yield back time.
Gentleman yields back. Other members? Gentleman from New York, Mr. Tom Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I speak in support of the Engel Amendment. I agree with what my colleague expressed, my colleague from New York expressed. His concerns are real about there being a number of policy and technical issues with the CASPER provisions in the Sense Act. One that I want to reiterate and certainly expand upon is regarding states' rights. The Sense Act would block a state from determining their best compliance pathway as it applies to CASPER. And let me say that another way. If this bill were to become law, it would actually take power away from the states and give it to the EPA. And as John Walke from the Natural Resource Defense Council pointed out in his written testimony for the recent legislative hearing on this bill, the Sense Act would wrest control away from states to make these basic decisions for the first time in the 39-year history of the Clean Air Act's interstate air pollution program. So in dealing with this issue, the Engel Amendment would allow states to opt out of the CASPER provisions from the Sense Act, thereby avoiding the states' rights issue, which is tremendously important. And all of the other technical and policy issues that have been raised regarding the portion of the bill would also be addressed by the amendment. So therefore, I urge my colleagues to join me in support of the Engel Amendment, and with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New York. Recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes no. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield votes no. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes no. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes no. Mr. Walden. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy votes no. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes no. Mrs. Blackburn. Ms. Blackburn votes no. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes no. Mrs. McMorris-Rogers. Mrs. McMorris-Rogers votes no. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes no. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes no. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes no. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes no. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes no. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo votes no. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes no. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes no. Mr. Bilirakis. Mr. Bilirakis votes no. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Bilirakis is not recorded. Mr. Long. Mr. Long votes no. Mrs. Elmers. Mrs. Elmers votes no. Mr. Bouchon. Mr. Bouchon votes no. Mr. Flores. Mr. Flores votes no. Mrs. Brooks. Mrs. Brooks votes no. Mr. Mullen. Mr. Mullen votes no. Mr. Hudson. Mr. Hudson votes no. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins votes no. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer votes no. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes aye. Miss Eshoo. Miss Eshoo votes aye. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel votes aye. Mr. Green. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes aye. Ms. Capps. Ms. Capps votes aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes aye. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch votes aye. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes aye. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes aye. Mr. Yarmouth. Mr. Yarmouth votes aye. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark votes aye. Mr. Loebsack. Mr. Schrader. Mr. Loebsack votes aye. Mr. Schrader. Mr. Schrader votes aye. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy votes aye. Mr. Cardenas. Mr. Cardenas votes aye. Chairman Upton.
Votes no. Other members wishing to cast a vote? Mr. Walden.
Mr. Walden votes nay.
Other members wishing to vote or change their vote? Seeing none, the clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 22 ayes and 29 nays.
22 ayes, 29 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the bill itself. H.R. 3797, a recorded vote has been asked for. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield votes aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes aye. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes aye. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden votes aye. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy votes aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes aye. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn votes aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes aye. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mrs. McMorris Rogers votes aye. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes aye. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes aye. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes aye. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes aye. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo votes aye. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes aye. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes aye. Mr. Bilirakis. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Long. Mr. Long votes aye. Mrs. Elmers. Mrs. Elmers votes aye. Mr. Bouchon. Mr. Bouchon votes aye. Mr. Flores. Mr. Flores votes aye. Mrs. Brooks. Mrs. Brooks votes aye. Mr. Mullen. Mr. Mullen votes aye. Mr. Hudson. Mr. Hudson votes aye. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins votes aye. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer votes aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes no. Miss Eshoo. Miss Eshoo votes no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel votes no. Mr. Green. Miss DeGette. Miss DeGette votes no. Miss Capps. Miss Capps votes no. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes no. Miss Schakowsky. Miss Schakowsky votes no. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes no. Miss Matsui. Miss Matsui votes no. Miss Castor. Miss Castor votes no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes no. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch votes no. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes no. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes no. Mr. Yarmouth. Mr. Yarmouth votes no. Miss Clark. Miss Clark votes no. Mr. Loebsack. Mr. Loebsack votes no. Mr. Schrader. Mr. Schrader votes no. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy votes no. Mr. Cardenas. Mr. Cardenas votes no. Chairman Upton.
Votes aye. Other members wishing to cast a vote? Change their vote? Seeing none, the clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 29 ayes and 22 nays.
29 ayes, 22 nays. The vote is favorably reported from the committee. The chair will now call up H.R. 4557 and ask the clerk to report.
H.R. 4557, to allow for judicial review of any final rule addressing national emission standards for hazardous air pollutants for brick and structural clay products or for clay ceramic manufacturing before requiring compliance with such rule.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Are there any amendments to the bill? Seeing none, the vote will occur. Oh, wait. Oh, I'm sorry.
Mr. Chairman.
Chair will recognize the gentleman from Illinois for 5 minutes to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, in describing the need for this bill, say that it is necessary in order to delay the Environmental Protection Agency's Brick-Mac rule until all judicial review has been completed. However, that's completely false. The courts already have the ability to issue a stay of any compliance dates in a final rule as necessary to protect the public interest. That is their job, and we should not let them do it. We all know that there have already been challenges filed regarding this final rule. It will be up to the D.C. Circuit, when they review these challenges, to decide whether to stay the rule. Well-established legal factors exist for granting a stay. These factors take into account whether there is a likelihood of success on the merits, the prospect of irreparable harm to the moving parties and other parties, and most importantly, Mr. Chairman, whether granting the stay is in the public interest. The courts have used these factors time and time again to determine whether to stay, to issue a grant to stay, or for how long. There's no reason for Congress to override this process. There's no reason for Congress to question the judgment of the court. I think that before we rationally conclude on behalf of the D.C. Circuit that the compliance deadlines for the BRIC-MAC final rule should be extended, we should let them take a final look at this final rule. And ultimately, Mr. Chairman, if a stay is necessary, the court can grant the stay and not the Congress. And I urge my colleagues to vote against this bill.
Gentleman yields back. Chair would recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you,
Strike the
Mr.
last-
Chairman. I appreciate the recognition, and I certainly understand our colleague from Illinois and his comments, but it basically boils down to this. When is enough enough? Certainly, the brick industry could file lawsuits and pump millions of dollars into court cases to have something remedied that actually should not need a remedy in the first place. Brick companies have already been through this already. If you recall, the EPA finalized similar standards in 2003. The brick industry spent hundreds of millions of dollars to comply and put control technology in place, only to have a federal court set aside that 2003 rule. And then when the EPA came back with this latest round, they started with a baseline of the set-aside rule rather than giving the brick industry credit for the emission reductions that they had achieved. It's troubling to think that we could be repeating this same thing. Many of these brick companies are small businesses throughout America. Some 7,000 people are employed in the brick industry. And, you know, we talk about the need to fix America's infrastructure. What are we going to do when our brick manufacturers can no longer produce brick because they're run out of business by the EPA, and we don't import brick here in America? We're going to be ceding the high ground, and we're going to once again give our competitors overseas the opportunity to compete on an unlevel playing field with America's companies. So I urge my colleagues to support this legislation, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair would recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone. Strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The BRIC Act extends compliance deadlines for EPA's brick and clay rules until all legal challenges are resolved by the courts. But delaying the rule should not be taken lightly, and the blanket extension in the BRIC Act would only serve to incentivize frivolous litigation in an effort to stall and avoid compliance with EPA's rules. Now, I appreciate that there are special circumstances related to this particular rule. I know there's a long history regarding this rule that dates back to a final rule in 2003 that was later vacated by the courts. And I also know that the majority of these plants are small businesses, and these plants often employ large numbers of workers from the surrounding communities. So I'm sensitive to the impact a rule like this can have on plants and jobs. What I've gathered from the recent legislative hearing on this bill and from the subcommittee markup is that it's too early to know what the compliance picture looks like for the BRIC MACT rule. In fact, this rule just became effective in late December of 2015, so we're about 2 months into a 3-year compliance period, and there's an option for a 4th year if necessary to finish installation of controls. Rather than rushing to approve a bill to indefinitely delay a Clean Air Act rule, something that I did not take lightly, I would suggest we encourage the brick industry to continue investigating its options for complying. I've heard industry estimates that this rule will cost about $100 million per year to comply with, but I've also heard that individual plants are still investigating their options for how to comply. EPA noted in their written testimony for the recent legislative hearing on the bill that in the final BRIC rule they developed flexible compliance options and also made distinctions between requirements for small and large kilns in order to reduce the impacts of the rule on small businesses. I'm hopeful that the industry will look at these flexibilities and figure out ways to comply that are less costly than their initial estimates. And I understand the industry recently met with the EPA to discuss the rule and compliance with it. I encourage these talks to continue. If the industry determines they need additional help, then under existing law they have the right to seek a stay through the courts. But I continue to think that this combination, that is the industry working with the EPA, using existing authority to seek a stay if absolutely necessary, is a better path than pursuing a legislative fix. As was the case when we considered a similar provision for power plants in the Ratepayer Protection Act, the litigation delay in the BRIC Act creates a very bad precedent, and therefore I oppose this bill, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the bill or offer amendments? Seeing none, the question now occurs in favorably reporting H.R. 4557 to the House. A roll call has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield votes aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes aye. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden votes aye. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy votes aye. Mr. Burgess. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn votes aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes aye. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mrs. McMorris Rogers votes aye. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes aye. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes aye. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes aye. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes aye. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo votes aye. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes aye. Mr. Griffith votes aye. Mr. Bilirakis. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Long. Mr. Long votes aye. Mrs. Elmers. Mrs. Elmers votes aye. Mr. Bouchon. Mr. Bouchon votes aye. Mr. Flores. Mr. Flores votes aye. Mrs. Brooks. Mrs. Brooks votes aye. Mr. Mullen. Mr. Mullen votes aye. Mr. Hudson. Mr. Hudson votes aye. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins votes aye. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer votes aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes no. Miss Eshoo. Miss Eshoo votes no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel votes no. Mr. Green. Miss DeGette. Miss DeGette votes no. Miss Capps. Miss Capps votes no. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes no. Miss Schakowsky. Miss Schakowsky votes no. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes no. Miss Matsui. Miss Matsui votes no. Miss Castor. Miss Castor votes no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes no. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch votes no. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes no. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes no. Mr. Yarmouth. Mr. Yarmouth votes no. Miss Clark. Miss Clark votes no. Mr. Loebsack. Mr. Loebsack votes no. Mr. Schrader. Mr. Schrader votes no. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy votes no. Mr. Cardenas. Mr. Cardenas votes no. Chairman Upton.
Votes aye.
Chairman Upton votes aye.
Other members, Dr. Burgess, how does Dr. Burgess record?
Dr. Burgess votes aye.
Are there other members wishing to cast a vote or change a vote? Seeing none, the clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 28 ayes and 22 nays.
28 ayes, 22 nays. The bill, H.R. 4557, is favorably reported. Chair would now call up H.R. 4238 and ask the clerk to report.
H.R. 4238, to amend the Department of Energy Organization Act and the Local Public Works Capital Development and Investment Act of 1976 to modernize terms related to minorities.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Are there any amendments to the bill? Seeing none, the question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 4238 to the House. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. Opinion Chair, the ayes have it. The bill is favorably reported. Chair will now call up H.R. 4427 and ask the clerk to report.
H.R. 4427, to amend Section 203 of the Federal Power Act.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Are there any amendments to the bill? Chair would recognize the gentleman from Illinois to offer an amendment. The clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 4427, offered by Mr. Rush. At the end of the bill, add the following new sections.
And the without objection, the amendment will will be dispensed with. The staff will distribute the amendment, and the gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, during the subcommittee hearing, we heard testimony from Mr. Minzer, who is the general counsel for FERC, regarding the serial mergers as a possible concern. Mr. Minzer stated that the Commission would no longer have the authority to review and approve mergers valued at less than $10 million, even in situations where the merger took place as one of a series of transactions.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
We're prepared to accept the amendment. I think we'd still like to work on it between now and then, but we're prepared to accept the amendment if the gentleman will accept that.
I certainly will accept that, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back graciously.
Gentleman yields
Mr.
back,
Chairman.
and the vote will occur on the amendment. Those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. Opinion Chair, the ayes have it. Further amendments to the bill? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the bill H.R. 4427 as amended. Those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. Opinion Chair, the ayes have it. The bill is favorably reported. Chair now calls up H.R. 4444 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 4444, to amend the Energy Policy and Conservation Act to exclude power supply circuits, drivers, and devices designed to be connected to and power light-emitting diodes or organic light-emitting diodes providing illumination from energy conservation standards for external power supplies and for other purposes.
That is about the longest title I've ever heard, but without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill will be open for amendment. The Chair will recognize the gentlelady from Tennessee for a colloquy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank everybody for their hard work in drafting H.R. 4444. And I know it will alleviate some of the regulatory burden on entrepreneurs. And we all want to encourage energy efficiency. And this bill will allow that to happen by giving the LED lighting industry and direct current ceiling fans greater flexibility with the external power supply efficiency level 6. Universal Lighting is headquartered in Nashville. They employ about 100 Tennesseans, and this is important to them, and of course our ceiling fan manufacturer is important to them. There are other niche industries that will be adversely affected by EPS regulation. One of those is the music performance industry. Music recording and performance is made possible because of external power supplies, and they are only effective as long as they do not interfere with musical instruments and audio devices. It is impossible for external power supplies to meet efficiency level 6 without generating more electromagnetic interference and adding noise to audio circuits. I wish we could work this out before this bill goes to the floor. It is important to the performance industry, to the concert industry, to the recording industry to get this right, and knowing that they're going to be facing additional regulation to make certain that there is a way to waiver them out of that. I look forward to working with my colleagues. I feel like we have to find a solution to this issue in order to enable those that are in the performance, concert, and music recording industry to be able to continue without that kind of electromagnetic interference in their daily work. And I yield back to the chairman.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair would recognize. No, is that all?
Mr. Chairman, can I move to strike the last word?
Who waited? Is that Renee? Yeah.
I just want to
recognize
say,
gentlelady from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate so much the committee working with us on this issue. I do look forward to it moving swiftly to the floor because of the time constraints that are approaching. But I would like to work with the gentlelady from Tennessee on this if there's a way that we can, move swiftly on helping that situation. I certainly understand this situation, and as complicated as this has been for me to understand, it certainly, I truly understand the dilemma that you are facing with this as well.
Will the gentlelady yield?
Yes, I'll yield to the gentlelady.
Thanks. I just want to thank Congresswoman Elmers for working on this bill with me, and also Ms. Matsui and Mr. Pompeo for helping us with it. I want to address Congresswoman Blackburn's issues because they are very real issues and something that we're trying to work with her on. I want to echo what Congresswoman what Congresswoman Elmers is saying, which is that already this rule has taken effect and it started to affect the LED lighting manufacturers. That's why we've had to write a letter asking them to forbear on enforcement until we get this done. So that's why we have to move it along. But we really do want to work on these issues as it moves to the floor, and we want to, certainly we don't want the music industry to be affected in any way. And so we need to work on it. But this is an important change that's going to really help these innovations that move forward, and so it needs to happen.
If the gentlelady will yield.
It's Ms. Elmer's time.
Yes, it is important, and lighting is important to your concert and performances and to the LED innovation. But what we have to realize is the electromagnetic fields and the static that causes. Sometimes you call it white space. And the feedback that you get in that is vitally important that we address this because there are already rulemakings in place, and we have to ask for the forbearance or amend it onto the bill or quickly, separately, legislatively address this. I yield back to Ms. Elmers.
Both of my colleagues and for the other members on committee that have worked on this, and I really would like to say that if there's a way that we can move swiftly, I truly want to remedy this problem. And what I can say is if we can't find that sweet spot where we can amend what we have or bring it to the floor in such a manner that I will be with you on this issue as well, keeping in mind again that there are time constraints and all the different industries.
Yield back.
I yield back unless someone else.
Chair would recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Capps.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I move to strike the last word just simply to underscore the importance of the fact that this legislation is very overdue, and I appreciate that we're having this markup today. I've spoken multiple times regarding the importance of LED research and innovation for both improving efficiency options for the lighting sector and advancing our knowledge of this critical technology. And H.R. 4444 is essential to ensuring that we are providing a regulatory framework that recognizes the importance of LEDs and meeting our energy efficiency efficiency needs for lighting, while at the same time allowing the industry to continue striving to improve upon this technology. It's making leaps and bounds. The bill will ensure that companies like Cree Lighting in my district will continue working to innovate and implement this revolutionary technology. So I urge our colleagues all to vote yes on this bill. Hope we can work to bring this legislation to the floor as quickly as possible. And I can yield to anyone else or yield back. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the bill, the chair would recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone.
Thank you. In support of the bill, I just wanted to say that LEDs get swept up in the energy conservation standards for external power supplies because they are powered by solid-state lighting drivers that bear superficial similarities to the kind of chargers that Congress directed DOE to set standards for. However, LED drivers aren't designed to operate when disconnected from LEDs, and so they can't be tested in the same way as other external power supplies. This means that even though they're very energy efficient, they can't comply with the standards. And the same is true of a new generation of energy efficient ceiling fans. So this legislation still holds these devices accountable to energy conservation standards, and it makes DOE's authority to prescribe separate energy conservation standards for LED drivers explicit. And ceiling fans with direct current motors would still be required to meet DOE's energy conservation standards for ceiling fans. I just wanted to point out, I know we've had some discussion that during the last couple of weeks, we've been made aware by Representative Blackburn that a small specialty business in her district might be irreparably harmed by the new EPS standards. Both the Democratic and Republican committee staff have been working with her office, her constituent, Department of Energy, and stakeholders to try to address this situation. And I think we all agree that Representative Blackburn's constituent has a legitimate problem. We all want to help. As we all tried in good faith to draft a potential legislative solution, it became abundantly clear that this situation could more quickly and efficiently be remedied through an administrative route rather than a legislative one. It also became clear that we could not readily put together a legislative fix without running the risk of upending the careful balance struck in the bill and derailing the fast track to enactment that we all hope this bill is on. So I just wanted to thank Representative Blackburn for recognizing this and agreeing to forego amending the bill. I want to make clear to her that I will work with her, her constituent, our colleagues, and DOE to ensure that her constituent gets the administrative waiver we all believe the company deserves. In fact, I believe that ACEEE, the lead organization for the efficiency community in this bill, is willing to help your constituent navigate the waiver process if you so desire. We'll also work to ensure that no enforcement action is taken against your constituent as the company pursues this administrative remedy. And although we think this effort to obtain administrative relief will succeed, we could, of course, work with you on a legislative fix on the chance that this effort somehow falls short. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to conclude by commending Representatives Black and DeGette, along with Representative Yarmouth, who played a large role in adding the fan language to the bill. And I urge my colleagues to vote yes on the bill so that consumers and businesses can continue to take full advantage of these energy-efficient products that will save power and money. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak? Seeing none, the question now occurs in favorably reporting H.R. 4444 to the House. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. Opinion share. The ayes have it. The bill is reported. Now, it's my understanding that the remaining bills are all non-controversial but important, and the Parles will not let me put them as one in block, but we have a pretty good way to do it here. So the chair will ask unanimous consent that the committee adopt and favorably report to the House of Representatives H.R. 2080, a bill to extend the deadline for commencement of construction of a hydroelectric project involving Clark Canyon Dam. Without objection, so ordered. Chair asks unanimous consent that the committee adopt and favorably report to the House H.R. 2081, a bill to extend the deadline for commencement of construction of a hydroelectric project involving the Gibson Dam. Without objection, so ordered. Chair would ask unanimous consent that the committee adopt and favorably report to the House H.R. 3447, a bill to extend the deadline for commencement of construction of a hydroelectric project involving the W. Kerr Scott Dam. Without objection, so ordered. Chair asks unanimous consent that the committee adopt and favorably report to the House H.R. 4411, a bill to extend the deadline for commencement of construction of a hydroelectric project involving the Gaithright Dam. Without objection, so ordered. Chair asks unanimous consent that the committee adopt and favorably report to the House H.R. 4416, a bill to extend the deadline for commencement of a construction of a hydroelectric project involving the Jennings-Randolph Dam. Without objection, so ordered. The chair would ask unanimous consent that the committee adopt and favorably report to the House H.R. 4412, a bill to extend the deadline for commencement construction of a hydroelectric project involving the Flanagan Dam. Without objection, so ordered. Chair would ask unanimous consent that the committee adopt and favorably report to the House H.R. 4434, a bill to extend the deadline for commencement of a construction of a hydroelectric project involving the Cannonsville Dam. Without objection, so ordered. That now concludes the legislative activity of the committee for the morning. I would like to insert for the record, under unanimous consent, a letter from FERC, a letter written to myself and Mr. Pallone regarding views on 4411 and 4412, and also a letter from the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association to myself and Mr. Pallone regarding H.R. 2984, the Fair Rate Payer Accountability Transparent Act. Without objection, the letters will be included as part of the record. And without objection, the staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the legislation approved by the committee today, so ordered. And without objection, the committee stand adjourned. Thank you.